as that group was, they noticed a small piece called Losing Chase that was way under the radar. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you the Queen.
The red sofa had never felt this tense. Two very different public figures found themselves sharing the spotlight, and from the start, the energy was impossible to ignore. At one end sat Helen Mirren, the acclaimed actress and dame of the British Empire, known for portraying Queen Elizabeth II and speaking often about duty and service. At the other end sat Meghan Markle, whose journey in and out of royal life has kept people talking for years. The contrast between their experiences immediately caught everyone's attention. It all began with what seemed like a simple comment. Helen reflected on the idea of responsibility, sharing lessons she had taken from playing the late Queen and the demands that come with public service. Meghan responded, and the reaction in the studio was impossible to miss. Audience members shifted in their seats as the conversation took an unexpected turn. As the interview continued, the atmosphere grew even more intense. Questions were raised, viewpoints were challenged, and the room became noticeably quieter. The audience watched closely as the discussion unfolded, creating a moment that had everyone paying attention. This is the interview that had viewers talking long after the cameras stopped rolling. The Graham Norton Show studio carried its usual Friday night buzz. The famous red sofa was ready, the audience had drinks in hand, and the setting felt familiar. But there was a different kind of anticipation in the air tonight, with many eager to see how this unique guest lineup would play out. Dame Helen Mirren was on the show to promote the BBC's documentary marking the centenary of Queen Elizabeth II, while Meghan Markle, Duchess of Sussex, was there to discuss her advocacy and public projects. Two other guests, a comedian and a musician, were also part of the lineup, but as the night went on, they would receive far less attention than anyone expected. Helen arrived first, bringing her usual warmth and elegance. She greeted people with ease and settled onto the famous red sofa like someone completely at home. After decades in the public eye and a celebrated career spanning more than 50 years, she carried herself with quiet confidence and experience. Meghan arrived shortly afterward, poised and prepared for the cameras. She took her seat at the opposite end of the sofa, appearing calm, focused, and ready for the conversation ahead. "Welcome everyone," Graham announced with a grin. "This is going to be quite a show." At the time, it sounded like a routine introduction, but the audience would soon realize the evening had an unusual energy. "Helen," Graham began, "the BBC documentary about Queen Elizabeth's centenary features you prominently. What drew you back to discussing her?" Helen smiled warmly. She would have been 100 this year. 100 years of life and decades of service as Queen. That's remarkable. That's a life dedicated to others, and I wanted to honor that. "You played her so beautifully in The Queen," Graham replied. "What did you learn about her through that process?" Helen paused before answering. "I learned that duty isn't a burden for some people. It's an identity." Helen continued her reflection thoughtfully. She woke up every morning knowing her life wasn't entirely her own, that her preferences, her desires, and her personal feelings often came second to the role. Most people can't imagine that level of sacrifice. Meghan shifted slightly on the sofa before responding. Not everyone experiences the institution as sacrifice. Some experience it as a cage. Helen turned toward her with interest. "Do they? I spent years studying that institution, reading about it, and trying to understand its weight. What I found was complexity, not cruelty." "You studied it from outside," Meghan replied. "I lived it from inside." "For a few years," Helen answered. "I studied it for decades." Respectfully, observation and participation offer different perspectives, but duration can provide depth as well. Graham let out a nervous laugh. "Well, we've got both perspectives right here on the sofa." "We do," Helen said, keeping her tone calm but firm. "And I'm curious about something. The institution you describe as a cage is also the one that brought enormous public attention to your life. How do you reconcile criticizing something while also acknowledging the opportunities that came with it?" Meghan's expression became more serious. "I earned my place through my marriage," Helen nodded. "And that marriage connected you to an institution recognized around the world. The title you hold came through that connection, and it certainly increased public interest in your work." "I've built my own platform since leaving," Meghan replied. "That's fair," Helen said. "But many people would argue that the public attention, media deals, interviews, and speaking opportunities were influenced, at least in part, by that royal connection. Do you think that's a reasonable observation?" The tension on the sofa became impossible to ignore, and Graham quickly looked for a way to steer the conversation forward before it grew even more intense. "Perhaps we could talk about something else," Graham began. "No," Helen said quietly. "I'd like to explore the question a little further." The room grew noticeably still. What work do you feel stands completely on its own merits? Helen asked, independent of any title, family connection, or public association. A brief pause followed before Meghan answered. I had a successful career before meeting Harry. Helen nodded. You were working and building a career, absolutely. But public visibility can change dramatically depending on circumstances. That's true for many people in the spotlight. The question is how much of your current influence comes from your own work, and how much comes from the attention surrounding your personal story. The audience listened closely as the conversation became more intense. I've worked on meaningful projects since then, Meghan replied. And that's important, Helen said. But when public figures speak about impact, people naturally want to know the results. They want examples, outcomes, and measurable achievements. That's the standard many organizations face. Graham shifted in his seat. Helen, perhaps. Helen continued calmly. I've spent decades working with charities and public causes. Over time, people expect to see tangible results. That's not criticism. It's accountability. Meghan sat forward. I don't think it's fair to frame this as an interrogation. Helen raised a hand slightly. Then think of it as a discussion. Public figures often face difficult questions, especially when they've spoken openly about major institutions and public issues. The atmosphere on the red sofa had become impossible to ignore. Helen then turned to another topic that had generated public debate. There always seems to be endless speculation about family relationships, she said. Stories appear, reports circulate, and commentators rush to draw conclusions. But at some point, people have to ask whether public disputes help repair relationships or make them harder. Meghan shook her head. Much of what's written is speculation. That may be true, Helen replied. But public perception is powerful. Fair or unfair, people often judge actions by the consequences they see. By now, Graham was gripping his cue cards tightly as he searched for a way to ease the growing tension in the studio. Ladies, maybe we should, Graham started. I'd like to know something, Helen said, calmly cutting back in. The audience immediately sensed the tension rising. When you married Harry, what did you expect would happen? Helen asked. Did you think an institution with centuries of traditions would suddenly change overnight? That long-standing rules and expectations would be adjusted around a new arrival? I expected basic decency, Meghan replied. Helen nodded slightly. And that's a fair expectation. But many people would argue that you were also given extraordinary opportunities. A globally watched wedding, worldwide recognition, a title, resources, and a platform that few people will ever experience. So when you talk about being treated unfairly, some viewers wonder where the line is. The treatment from the press, Meghan began. The press has treated many public figures harshly, Helen replied. Diana faced it. Camilla faced it. Catherine faced years of criticism. Public scrutiny isn't new. The debate is whether your experience was different or whether your response to it was different. My response was honest. Others might say it became part of a business strategy, Helen said. The interviews, documentaries, books, and public appearances all became major stories. That's why some critics question whether these conversations are only about truth-telling or also about building a public brand. Meghan looked frustrated and shifted in her seat. You don't understand what I experienced. I only understand what the public has seen, Helen answered. They've seen interviews discussing painful experiences, documentaries sharing personal struggles, and books revealing private family matters. That's the picture many people have been given. I want peace. Do you? Helen asked. Because many people associate peace with privacy. They wonder whether repeatedly revisiting old conflicts makes healing easier or harder. Fair or not, that's a question that keeps coming up. The studio had become incredibly quiet. Graham cleared his throat. Perhaps the other guests would like to. Nobody moved. Nobody wanted to miss what happened next. Let me ask you something directly, Helen said, leaning forward slightly as the audience watched in complete silence. Helen leaned forward slightly, her expression serious. And I'd like an honest answer. Do you believe the public conversation about you reflects admiration, criticism, or a mix of both? The question landed heavily, and the studio fell silent. Meghan's composure appeared shaken. I'm supported by millions, Helen nodded. Millions follow your story, certainly. But public attention and personal support aren't always the same thing. Being watched isn't necessarily the same as being welcomed. That's the distinction many people debate. The tension on the red sofa became impossible to ignore. My husband supports me, Meghan replied. Of course, Helen said. But public reports and media speculation often suggest different interpretations of family relationships. The problem is that nobody outside those relationships truly knows the full story. Meghan reached for her purse. I won't sit here and be judged by someone who played my husband's grandmother in a film and thinks that makes her an authority. Helen responded with a measured smile. I don't claim authority. What I gained was perspective through years of research and study. I wanted to understand a woman whose life was defined by public service and responsibility. The audience listened closely as the exchange grew even more intense. What concerns some critics, Helen continued, is the contrast they see. They look at service on one side and personal branding on the other. They see interviews, documentaries, books, and public appearances, and they question the balance between advocacy and self-promotion. Meghan stood and took a step toward the exit. "This is outrageous," she said. "You're repeating the same criticisms people have used against me for years." Helen remained seated, calm, and composed. "No, I'm talking about public perception. Fair or unfair, many people see someone who joined a historic institution, left it, and then continued speaking about it while still being closely associated with it. That's why the debate never seems to end." She paused before adding one final thought. People can disagree about the details, but the real question is whether the conversation is helping anyone move forward, or simply keeping old conflicts alive. Public recognition can lead to more public recognition, Helen said. That's often how fame works. The question is what someone chooses to do with that attention afterward. By this point, Graham had almost stopped trying to steer the discussion elsewhere. The comedian and musician sat quietly, unsure whether to jump in as the conversation continued to dominate the room. "You'll regret this," Meghan said. Helen remained calm. "At this stage of my life, I don't regret asking difficult questions. I've spent decades building a career and speaking my mind. People are free to disagree with me, but honest discussion shouldn't be something we fear." The atmosphere was incredibly tense. Meghan paused near the edge of the stage. "You don't know me," she said. Helen nodded. "That's true. I don't know you personally. None of us truly know public figures the way we think we do. We only know what is presented publicly, and people will interpret that in different ways," she continued carefully. "Some people see a story of independence and resilience. Others see a story of conflict and controversy. The debate exists because different audiences draw different conclusions." Meghan shook her head before leaving the stage. Moments later, the studio door closed behind her. The famous red sofa sat in stunned silence. Graham looked toward Helen, then at the other guests, and finally out to the audience. "Well," he said with a nervous laugh, "that certainly happened." Helen adjusted her sleeve calmly. "I apologize if the discussion became overwhelming. That wasn't my intention." "You didn't exactly fade into the background," Graham replied with a weak smile. "I'm not sure we've ever had a conversation quite like that on this sofa." The comedian finally spoke. "Honestly, I've got nothing," he said. "No joke is surviving after that." The audience laughed, breaking the tension at last. Helen laughed too, warm and genuine. Comedy after a serious debate is never easy. Graham nodded immediately. "Yes, let's move to something lighter, much lighter." But the audience was still buzzing. They had just watched a dramatic exchange unfold, and the energy in the studio hadn't faded. Before the show moved on, Helen raised a hand. "One thing I'd like to say," she said, turning toward the audience and camera. "I was actually raised with very different views about the monarchy. My parents would have been astonished that I eventually played the Queen. That's what makes life interesting. It can challenge your assumptions and change your perspective." Helen continued, her voice steady as the audience listened closely. "Through studying Elizabeth II, through genuinely trying to understand her life, I came to appreciate something I had once overlooked. The weight of duty, the discipline, and the endurance required to spend decades serving in a role where personal wishes often came second to public responsibility." She paused for a moment before, continuing. "What I've always respected is the idea of service. Whether people support the monarchy or not, many admired the dedication they believed the late Queen represented. That's what I was thinking about tonight." The studio remained quiet. Helen made it clear that her comments reflected her own perspective. She argued that public debates about the royal family often become focused on personal grievances rather than broader questions about responsibility, service, and public life. Graham nodded slowly. "You've certainly made your views clear. I hope the discussion encourages reflection," Helen replied. "Though people don't always agree when their experiences and interpretations are so different." The musician finally spoke up. "My grandmother watched the Queen's Christmas broadcasts every year. She always admired her." Helen smiled warmly. "A lot of people felt that way. Whether you agreed with the institution or not, many saw qualities they respected. The audience responded with scattered applause. When the episode aired later that evening, clips from the discussion spread rapidly online. Viewers debated the exchange from every angle. Some praised Helen's defense of duty and tradition, while others felt Meghan's perspective deserved greater understanding and sympathy. Quotes from the conversation circulated across social media, television programs, and newspaper columns. Commentators argued over who made the stronger case, and the debate quickly became one of the most talked about television moments of the week. Soon afterward, reports claimed that Meghan's representatives viewed the interview negatively and believed the discussion had been unfairly confrontational. Supporters on both sides weighed in, ensuring that the controversy continued long after the studio lights had gone out. In the story, Helen's representatives later pushed back against claims that the exchange had been planned in advance. Coordinated? The statement reportedly said. I spoke spontaneously based on years of study, observation, and engagement with the history of the monarchy. The questions reflected my own views and experiences. The statement continued by emphasizing Helen's long-standing interest in royal history and her experience portraying Queen Elizabeth II on screen. I've played the Queen. I've met the Queen. I've spent years learning about her life and legacy. When public debates touch on that legacy, I naturally pay attention. At this point in my life, I'm comfortable expressing my opinions openly. For Helen, the moment was portrayed by supporters as an extension of the work she had done for decades. Many argued that her years of researching and portraying royal figures gave weight to her perspective, particularly when discussing Queen Elizabeth II and the idea of public service. For Meghan, the exchange generated a very different reaction. Supporters felt she was unfairly challenged, while critics argued that difficult questions come with public life. The discussion quickly spread across television, newspapers, and social media, where viewers dissected every moment. What many people focused on wasn't necessarily who won the argument, but the contrast between two very different life stories. Helen was seen by admirers as someone whose reputation had been built through decades of acting, public work, and professional achievement. Meghan's supporters pointed to her own career, advocacy efforts, and public influence. Critics, however, questioned how much of her prominence was connected to her royal association. The questions Helen raised became the center of the public debate. Some viewers felt Meghan answered them effectively, while others believed key points remained unresolved. Regardless of where people stood, the exchange sparked intense discussion and left audiences arguing about service, fame, privilege, and public responsibility long after the broadcast ended, and in that silence, viewers were left to draw their own conclusions. The discussion had moved beyond personalities and headlines and into a larger debate about achievement, public image, responsibility, and recognition. To many watching, the contrast between the two perspectives was impossible to ignore. On one side was Helen Mirren, an Oscar-winning actress and dame whose reputation was built over decades of work, dedication, and accomplishment. On the other side was a public figure whose journey continues to spark strong opinions and endless debate. The questions raised during the conversation lingered long after the cameras stopped rolling. What earns lasting respect? Is it influence, visibility, service, achievement, or something else entirely? Those answers were left for the audience to decide. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss future uploads. And let us know in the comments, what do you think truly earns respect in public life? We'd love to hear your thoughts.